Thank you everyone for coming. I'm Emily Almeida Lopez. I'm the voting rights advocate for Disability Law Center. And today we are going to be doing a training on how to survey a polling place for accessibility issues. So just some basic background on who we are at Disability Law Center. We're a nonprofit legal services organization that also serves as the protection and advocacy agency for Massachusetts. Which means we provide legal advocacy on disability issues. We promote fundamental rights of all individuals with disabilities to fully participate in the social and economic life of Massachusetts. And if you have a broader systemic issue with disability stuff, we're one of the organizations that you would go to. And so what is a P&A? It is a federally mandated system that exists in every state and territory, and there's one big Native American consortium. We provide legal-based services through the protection of rights and advocacy for appropriate services for individuals with disabilities. There's different federal programs that have different focuses that we work under, and voting rights for people with disabilities is one of our major focuses. And so relevant laws for polling place accessibility, the ADA ensures and requires that all public entities have to make sure that their voting facilities are accessible, and ensuring access in that way can include temporary measures if there's not enough time to do a permanent fix. But obviously, any public entity has to still be accessible under the ADA. So HAVA kind of lays out what some of the requirements are for accessibility in terms of making sure that everyone can vote. It needs to be accessible for all individuals with disabilities, including non-visual accessibility for the blind and visually impaired, in a manner that provides the same opportunity for access and participation, including privacy and independence, that's important, as for all other voters. And then it has to satisfy a requirement for at least one direct recording electronic voting system or other voting system equipped for individuals with disabilities at each polling place. In Massachusetts, that's the AutoMark system. All right, so first major thing to remember for all of this surveying process is to relax. It can seem rather daunting to have all of these specific things to look out for, but even if you aren't able to perfectly measure and record everything, giving us some information and your experience voting is still very important. And the survey tool that we provide for this, the online survey tool, contains a lot of this information already. So if you get lost, it's not that difficult to refer back to the tool. There's usually a rough guide on what to look for. So some other things to remember when surveying: it's really important to not take pictures of people at the polls. Sometimes if you encounter a problem that might need some kind of picture taken of it, like any sort of broken infrastructure, it's important to give us visual evidence of that, but having people in pictures is a no-go. And then always it's important to check in with the head of the polling place and the different ward captains before you start your survey, just to make sure they know what's going on, that you're just here to survey for accessibility issues and not be intrusive or do anything partisan. And then if you do take a picture of an issue, it's important to try and get pictures from multiple angles and make sure they're of decent enough quality that we can see what's going on. And take notes of everything you observe or encounter to submit online via the survey afterwards. The more information you can provide to us, the better. And then if there's any sort of time-sensitive accessibility issue that is potentially actively stopping people from using the polls because of disability issues or anything like that, please notify the Secretary of the Commonwealth's office at the number listed there, or call me directly and I will try and make something happen to fix it at the number there. That's 617-221-8451. The Secretary of the Commonwealth's office's number is 1-800-462-8683. So call either or both of those numbers if you encounter some sort of time-sensitive accessibility issue. And then tools you might need. So number one is preferably a retractable tape measure for taking the length and width of things. If you can't get one or can't use one, the next closest thing in a pinch is to use anything that sort of can form a consistent reference point for like length, width, height. A lot of what we do in terms of measurements comes down to ratios for things like slope. And as long as you have a decent way of measuring, it can at least provide us some information. A phone, a camera, another way to take pictures or document what you're seeing. Again, it's important not to take pictures of people, but it is important to try and get evidence of any physical problems you encounter or anything like that. Some optional items, a copy of the ADA polling site checklist. I believe we have that available as a resource on the Disability Law Center website, or just looking up ADA polling site checklist will bring that up. That lists in detail a lot of the issues that may come up and a lot of the specific measurements. And another optional thing is a digital or bubble level for taking slope and a door pressure gauge for judging how heavy a door is. Those both are optional items. And then a non-optional thing is just some way to take notes on your experience and the polling site as you survey it so that you can refer back to it and send us a solid report. Tom, is this your section?
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
Thanks, Emily. Hi, everyone. My name's Tom Murphy. I'm a supervising attorney at DLC. And I'm going to be taking you through some of the things that you're going to be looking for when you do a polling place survey. Emily mentioned relax as one of the first things to keep in mind. And I want to emphasize that. You don't need to be an accessibility expert to do this. We greatly appreciate the assistance that you'll be giving us in terms of what you observe when you go to a polling place. Any information that you can provide us, positive or negative, is going to be helpful. So as we go through these steps and some of the more technical aspects of this, don't feel that you have to absorb all of this information and know it like black letter law. Don't feel that every single piece of information that we're going to give you is necessary for you to be looking for. Some of the polling places that you go to may not have some of the aspects of accessibility features that we're going to be talking about. There may not be a parking lot. There may not be ramps within the building. So don't feel like all of this information is information that you need to know verbatim. The purpose of this training is to give you a general sense of the types of issues that a person with a disability may encounter as they try to vote, and the types of accessibility features that you may be looking for or should be looking for, and some of the issues that may come up. So the first thing, before you go out, what I would encourage you to do is think through the steps that you take when you go to vote, because those obviously are the steps that a person with a mobility impairment or with another type of disability will also be going through in order to be voting themselves. And so think about what you do when you go to vote, and where you go and the things that you encounter while you're voting. So you would start with the exterior of the building, the parking area, the pathway that you would take to get into the polling place, the entrance itself. Then once you're inside the polling place, there are issues to think about, like, are there multiple levels? If so, is there an elevator or a wheelchair lift? what do the doors inside look like? How, are there hallways that you have to traverse in order to get to the actual polling place? If so, on those paths of travel, on those routes that you'll be taking, are there changes in level? And if so, how would a person with a mobility impairment navigate those types of issues that might come up? Things like signage, when you go to vote, there are usually signs telling you where to go. Well, make sure that it's there, and is it accessible? Is it in an area where people can view it easily? If there are alternative routes throughout the polling place for a person with a disability to get to where they need to go, is there adequate signage to make sure that they know where to go? Once you're inside the voting area, just take a look at the layout. Think about how much space there is. Would a person who uses a wheelchair have enough space to maneuver here in the areas that they need to go? Is the voting equipment accessible? You want to think about what do I need to do in order to cast my ballot? And then try to think about what a person with a disability might encounter if they're taking the same steps. If there are restrooms that are available, sometimes there are and sometimes there aren't. Check them out. See if they are accessible. Look for an accessible stall, height of the sink, things like that. And then the exit, if it's different from the way you came in, kind of go through the same steps that you went through, thinking about the interior of the building. Okay, Emily, next slide. So now, I'll talk about each of those aspects in a little bit more detail. The parking lot, if there is parking that is provided, does it meet the minimum number of HP spots? Emily, if I could ask you to just jump forward to the next slide while I'm on that point. This gives you an estimate of how many, depending on how many parking spaces there are, how many HP spots there need to be. And again, we're not going to ask that you count every parking space in the parking lot, but think about just generally, is it a smaller parking lot? Does it seem to have, between 1 and 25 spaces? If so, is there at least one accessible parking space? If it's a larger parking lot, are there multiple parking spaces? It's probably not going to be the case that you encounter a polling place that has a very large parking area, but maybe if there are up to, say, 100 spaces for like a larger school or something like that, there would need to be at least 4 designated accessible parking spaces. So if you do see a rather large parking lot, and there's only one designated space, that's an issue that you would want to flag. And that brings to mind another point I want to make. Keep in mind that for something like that, and for many of these issues, there isn't going to be necessarily a remedy, an on-the-spot remedy, something that can be fixed right away. For some things, maybe there would be propping doors open and things like that. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. But for some of these things, the remedy is probably not something that can happen, on election day. But again, providing us with the information so that we can then follow up on it is the point of this exercise. And hopefully, if you find violations, we can follow up on them, and those violations can be corrected so that going forward, that polling place is more accessible. So, Emily, can you jump back to the prior slide? Then I'll go back to parking and talk about that just a little bit more.
How do I? 1 second. Yep.
Thanks. So in addition to the number of accessible spots, things that you're going to be wanting to look for are signs. Are the designated accessible parking spaces are they designated as such with a visible elevated sign that's 5 to 8 feet off of the ground? Are there ground markings? Usually the spaces are painted. So are there markings to indicate that it is an accessible parking space? To give you a sense of what an accessible parking space is, generally it should be at least 8 feet wide, and it should have an adjacent level 4 foot access path, access aisle. Um, if there are as many as at least one of the accessible spaces should be van accessible. So that should have an extra 3 feet of width. So it should be 11 feet wide with a 4 foot access aisle. So if it's a smaller parking lot and there's only one accessible space, that single accessible space should be van accessible. If there are up to 6 accessible parking spaces, which is most likely the most that you'll encounter at polling places, then make sure that there is at least one that is designated van accessible. The parking area, should be clear. It should be reasonably well lit. It should be flat. It should be clear of gravel. It should be clear of mud. Any sort of obstruction. Again, use your common sense. Think about a person with a mobility impairment and whether they would have difficulty maneuvering around the area where the accessible parking is. I think that's especially important for the for fall elections. It's not unusual that we might have some snow or something like that would impede travel. Make sure that the accessible parking area is clear. If there is no parking lot for the polling place, there should be. So if so let's say it's a school in an urban setting, and there's only on-street parking. There should be at least one on-street parking space which is temporarily designated for election day as accessible. It should be marked. Should be clearly marked, and it should be designated as accessible parking. So there, you're going to want to look for that designation, make sure that it's visible. You're going to want to make sure that there's some indication of how to get, from that space, which may not be directly in front of the door, although hopefully it is, to get from there to the entrance to the polling place. And you're going to want to take a look at the path of travel. If they've designated a parking space on the street, hopefully there's a curb cut, right? Because if there's not, it would be difficult, if not impossible, for someone to get from the street parking space up onto the sidewalk in order to get into the building. So think about those path of travel issues. And if there's something that you see that concerns you, make a note of that. Just want to address the question that popped up. Should the entire parking sign be within the 5 to 8 feet high range, or can the bottom or top of the sign be within this range? I believe that the standard is that the bottom of the sign be between 5 and 8 feet off of the ground.
I believe that's the case, yeah.
So, and then the last thing that I'll say, and this is true, I think, especially if there's a polling place that's, say, in a school during while school is in session, sometimes the entrance to the polling place is not the main entrance to the building. All right. So, for instance, where I voted is a school, and the polling place is the gym, which has its own entrance, and the main entrance to the building is about 100 yards away. If that's the case, it may be that the way the parking lot was laid out, the accessible parking is close to the main entrance to the building, because that's usually what is used, and is not necessarily the closest to the entrance to the polling place if it's a separate entrance. So think about that. Think about the path of travel then, especially from from the accessible parking area to the entrance to the polling place. And make note of, if it's an exceptionally long distance, we may want to think about seeing if designated spaces can be made available on election day that are closer to the actual entrance that they use. So Emily, I think you can go ahead 2 slides now because we've covered that one. Yep. So now, again, thinking back to how I started, where you approach this, thinking about what do I do when I go to vote? What are the steps that I take in order to get into the polling place? So after the parking, the next thing that you would encounter would be pathways or sidewalks into the building. Again, if there is a parking lot and there are accessible parking spaces, there should be curb ramps in order to get up onto the sidewalk. Curb ramp should be at least 36 inches wide, 3 feet, and the slope should be no more than 1 in 12. So what slope obviously means, that the amount of vertical rise that you need to cover. And the 1 in 12 ratio means that there should be 1 foot of length of the ramp for every 1 inch of rise. So this is an area where your tape measure would come in handy. And the easiest thing to do here to measure slope is measure the amount of rise that needs to be covered. If it's a step, if it's a step up onto the sidewalk, or just think about a stair, measure the height of the stair. All right. So if the height of that step is 3 inches, then with the 1 in 12 ratio, that means 1 foot for every inch of rise. The length of the ramp would need to be at least 3 feet. Okay, so 3 feet for the 3 inch rise. If it's a 6 inch rise, then 6 foot ramp. 1 inch rise, 1 foot ramp. Again, this is not an exact science, but the information that you give us will be very helpful, especially if you think that there are ramps that are clearly not compliant, because obviously, if the slope is too great, then it could be very difficult and possibly also very dangerous for a wheelchair user to try to navigate that ramp. Look at the surface, make sure that it's slip resistant. Should be, usually if it's a curb ramp, it's going to either be concrete or asphalt. Make sure that it's clear of debris. Again, a November election, we could have anything from snow to leaves. And any sort of impediment on a ramp could create a very dangerous situation. So make note of it if you see that. In terms of the pathway, there should be no gap that's greater than a 1/2 inch wide. So cracks in the sidewalk, should definitely be noted. There should also be no lips or drops that are larger than a 1/4 of an inch. If there is some sort of lip, there may be a bevel there, so something that doesn't make it an abrupt 90-degree angle. And so if it is beveled, then the size of that lip can be up to a 1/2 an inch. But otherwise, if there are any changes in level in the pathway, they shouldn't be more than a 1/4 of an inch high. Make sure that the path to the accessible entrance, whether it be the main entrance to the polling place or a different entrance, is clearly marked, and that it's well lit, and at least 36 inches wide throughout the entire route. Think about whether the path of travel is the same or substantially similar for all persons entering the polling place. So again, you may have a situation where the accessible parking is in a different location than the entrance that's being used for the polling place. And if that's an excessively large amount of distance to travel, then that might be something that we would want to follow up with them about. So let us know. And also, if you're in an urban setting, most likely, and there's public transportation, think about where that bus or closest T station might be, um, and take a look at the path of travel from that public transportation to the entrance to the polling place, and think through all of these issues that we've talked about in terms of path of travel, changes in height and slope and things like that as well. Next slide, please, Emily. So then ramps, similar. I talked a little bit about in the last slide about curb ramps. If there are longer ramps within the polling place, because there are steps to get in or steps within the building. These are the things that you're going to want to look for if there is a ramp. Again, that 1 in 12 running slope is very important. If the amount of height that the ramp covers is greater than 6 inches, then the ramp should have handrails, obviously for safety. You want to make sure that the ramp is wide enough. It should be at least 48 inches wide if it's an interior ramp. And if it's a longer ramp, if it's more than about 6 or 8 feet long, there should probably be at least one landing area, so that person who's using a wheelchair doesn't have to cover the entire length of the ramp all at once. That there is there's an area to a level area, flat surface, where someone can stop and rest if they need to. Some places might have portable ramps that they may not be permanent. Portable ramps are okay to be used if necessary. And these same rules should generally apply. You want to make sure that you look at the slope, that it's as close to 1 in 12 as possible, and that there are handrails or wheel guards at least on the sides, for safety reasons. Next slide, please. So then entrances. All right. So now you're going into the polling place. There should be at least one accessible entrance that is unlocked. Take a look at any hardware or handles that are necessary to be operated in order to open the doors. Accessible hardware means that it can be operated with one hand with a closed fist. So in other words, a person should not need to grasp a door handle tightly or pinch or twist in any way to open a door in order for it to be accessible. The door should be have at least 32 inches of clear width when they're opened, and the threshold should be no more than a quarter of an inch that you have to go over in order to go through the door. Door opening force is probably something that you're not going to be able to measure. There are devices that can measure it. We don't expect you to have one. If you do, it's great. Generally 5 pounds of force is the standard. Any amount of force greater than 5 pounds in order to open a door creates accessibility issues. This is one where we're going to ask you to use your common sense. If you need to open a door to get into the polling place or to traverse throughout the polling place, how does it feel to you? Was it difficult to open? Does it feel like it needs an excessive amount of force in order to open the door? If it does, let us know. Or if you're comfortable, that's something that may be able to be rectified on the spot. Doors can be propped open. So if there is a door that someone has to go through in in order to get to a polling place, and it feels to you like it would be very difficult for a person with a disability to independently operate that door, talk to the person in charge of the polling place and see if perhaps the door can be propped open. Or if not, maybe a poll worker can be stationed there to provide assistance for someone if they need it. But certainly let us know if you have concerns. If the entrance to the polling place is not the same as the main entrance, this might be the case if there is a more accessible entrance that can get a person to the polling place than the main entrance. Make sure that there is adequate signage. Obviously a person's not going to know that there's a more accessible entrance if they're not informed. So things like signage are important, especially where there might be multiple entrances and one might be more accessible than the other. And if that is the case, if there is an alternative, more accessible entrance being used, make sure that it's unlocked. I've encountered situations where there's a quote unquote accessible entrance, but it's locked and a person can't independently use it in order to get to a polling place. And then the whole idea here is that every single person should independently be able to enter a polling place and vote and leave. And so if there's an entrance that is intended to be used because it's more accessible, but it's unlocked, then it's not accessible, and that's something that should be brought to the attention of the folks in charge. They may either unlock the door or station a poll worker there to make sure that people have the assistance that they need to get in. Next slide, please. So then, again, now we're inside the polling place. We're going to be thinking about an accessible route of travel, what we want to be looking for here. And the next slide goes into a little bit more detail with some visuals, but what we're going to be looking for are any obstructions, right? Protruding objects, things like that. Things that would either be a barrier for a person with a mobility impairment, or perhaps create a dangerous situation for a person who is visually impaired. So, think about you're walking through the hallway of an elementary school. There are going to be drinking fountains, most likely. There might be coat racks that are there for folks to use. There might be fire extinguishers that are attached to the walls. Display cases, open staircases. Where the stairs come down in such a way that you can actually walk into the riser if you don't know that it's there. For any of these obstructions, there should, we wouldn't ask necessarily that fire extinguishers be removed or that display cases be taken down, but they should be marked, right? So they can use cones or some sort of any sort of barrier that warns somebody that there is an obstruction, and especially for someone with a visual impairment who uses a white cane, the cones and other sort of warnings are absolutely essential. We would want to make sure that those are there if there are obstructions in the path of travel. And again, signage, if the accessible route to the polling place is different than the main route, there might be a change in level, a step or two on the main route, but so there may be a more accessible alternative route. Again, make sure that there is adequate signage to designate that. Next slide, please. So this sort of just teases out a little bit more what I was talking about on the last slide with the accessible path of travel, and kind of gives you a sense of some of the obstructions that could create an issue. So we have a visual of a person who's using a white cane, and that's going to detect anything that's in front of that person up to a height of 27 inches. So any protruding objects should be, the bottom of it should be no higher than 27 inches off of the floor. In terms of height, any obstructions that in the path of travel that are higher should be at least 80 inches off of the floor, so that someone even with a cane, which would not detect something that's at or above, say, like waist level, that a protruding object that's higher off the ground would not pose a hazard for that person. So again, it should be free of obstructions. The path of travel should be at least 36 inches wide. And if there are any steps or slopes, you want to make sure that there is either a ramp or some other alternative accessible path of travel. Next slide, please. The voting area is the next thing that you'll encounter when you're voting. You want to make sure that the space within which a person is expected to vote has at least 48 inches of turnaround space for a person using a wheelchair. There should be at least one accessible voting machine. It should be on a table. There's a visual here, which is accessible in terms of the height off of the ground, so that a person with a wheelchair would be able to get underneath the table. There should be signage that directs people to the accessible voting machine. There should, again, be no protruding objects, which we've talked about, and possibly also a seating area if they're if it's a busy polling place and waiting to cast your ballot is not unusual. They should be prepared with chairs for people who may not be able to stand in line for a long period of time. Next, please. The voting equipment that's being used, all polls are required to have sample ballots, and there are requirements for where those are placed. They should be no higher than 48 inches above the floor. In order to mark a paper ballot, I think we've all encountered the little cubicle that you use. There should be at least one that provides clear space underneath it that's 30 inches wide and 27 inches high, so that a person with a wheelchair would be able to access that particular voting cubicle. Voting machines, Emily's going to talk a little bit more about the AutoMark machine when I wrap up, and that should also have a sample ballot posted near it that's no higher than 48 inches. And voting levers, I'm not sure that these come into play in Massachusetts, but some of the machines, the older machines, have levers that you would have to maneuver in order to vote. And those should be at least 48 inches off of the floor as well, if you do happen to encounter that. Next, please. So Emily mentioned the AutoMark machine. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in just a couple of slides. The big issue, I think, that I've encountered with the AutoMark is that people don't, and when I say people, I mean the poll workers, they don't know how to use it. They haven't been trained, or they're not really sure what it's for. They know it's there, but they're not sure what it's for. And that's a problem. I always try to point that out to the poll warden or whoever's in charge, to make sure that they understand that this is a very important piece of equipment, that it gives people with disabilities the ability to vote independently, and that it should be operable. Sometimes it's just not plugged in. At least some of the maybe not all of them, but at least some of them should know how to use it. They really should, take a test run with it. It's not that complicated. I've used it myself. And the poll workers really need to be better educated on the use of accessible voting equipment. And then the other thing that I often encounter is that it's placed in an area that's not private. So if you vote with a paper ballot, like we saw in the last slide, generally you get your own little cubicle. It has walls around it. And the idea is that your vote is your vote and no one else is entitled to know how you voted. So you should be able to vote privately. Same is true for someone who uses an accessible voting machine. Their vote should be private as well. And so it should be in an area where people can't just mill about behind you and see what you're doing, because the screen is actually fairly large, and if somebody's standing behind you, they can see what you're doing. So that's something I try to point out as well if I see that. Next slide, please. So the last point I want to make, everything that we've talked about so far has had to do with sort of the physical infrastructure of a polling place. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that, there are rules for all of that, but there's also sort of a more general rule that reasonable accommodations under Title II of the ADA, which voting falls under, have to be provided at polling places for people with disabilities. And that could be any modification of any policies or practices or procedures that they use in order to give a person with a disability the ability to vote privately and independently. So, these may not necessarily be things that you're going to be looking out for, but just keep in mind, and maybe you'll encounter while you're there, you'll encounter someone who's essentially asking for an accommodation because they're asking for some sort of change in policy. So, for instance, letting someone sit down instead of standing in line to keep their space. Certainly, allowing service animals into a polling place is something that should be done, and that maybe you'll encounter a situation like that, and certainly speak up if you feel comfortable doing so, but don't feel that it's necessary. But certainly let us know if you see an issue or hear about an issue of someone using a service animal while they're voting. And also, polling places should allow a person with a disability to have assistance by a person of their choice in order to cast their ballot. So these are all types of accommodations that I think it's good for us to just keep in mind and be thinking about. And again, if you have any concerns or see or hear of anything that seems unusual, let us know. Again, a lot of this is based on common sense, and so I use the word unusual purposely, because if there's something that just doesn't feel right to you, let us know, and at the very least we can look into it and see if some sort of change needs to be recommended. Next slide. I think that's it for me, Emily, and now we're up to the auto mark. Yes.
Yes, we are. How are we doing on time? I want to be respectful of everyone's time and give people the option to ask questions. So I am going to skip the AutoMark video. That will be available when we share the slides, and I will also have it available on the Voting Rights Resources page at DLC, at DLC's website. So how to use the online survey. This link is also available, and we will have it up at DLC's website, but I will will this allow me to share it? Does that? Usually that does, but hold on.
I think maybe if you hit Control and then
yeah,
that should work.
Maybe it's, hold on. If no. Sorry, that technical difficulty there, but the link for the grassroots survey is there. It's a pretty simple survey to use when the link when the link opens, which for some reason the screen share doesn't seem to be liking. It's just a series of like fill in the bubble type online clickables there, and some occasional writing out of responses, and then a slot or two for uploading pictures. It works fine on tablets and phones. And all you have to do is there is a page that we will have on DLC's website and also be posting on social medias and other dissemination methods that you would click on to get there. I'm going to try it one more time, but I want to be respectful of time. So instead of fiddling with that, quick fixes, which were mentioned before, doors can be wedged open while place is being used as a polling place. Signs and traffic cones can be used to make temporary accessible parking in some cases. You can also use them to mark out, as Tom said, some things that might be problematic for people who have any kind of vision impairment. Temporary signs can be taped up and used to direct people. Temporary ramps are an acceptable stopgap measure for entrances that need them, for anyone who's setting up a polling place, and those are pretty readily available. And if an AutoMark needs a privacy shield, because it should have one, paper or cardboard can be used to kind of improvise and block off view of the screen for folks that shouldn't be seeing it. Okay, questions, and I will stop sharing my screen.
Okay, we have a question in the chat, and Sue has raised their hand. So why don't Sue go first, and then we'll get the chat question.
Thank you. Much of the discussion has focused on mobility and visual impairment. There are many people with invisible disabilities who have heart or lung problems. Are there any standards for how often there should be a bench or a place for someone to rest to get from public transit to the polling place or from the parking area to the polling place?
Thanks, Sue, for your question. The short answer is no. There are no set standards. So I would say that would be an issue that would be covered by reasonable accommodation, like I covered in the last slide, in terms of informing, poll workers that that an individual might need a chair to sit during the process, especially if there's waiting time. But in terms of throughout the path of travel, the answer is no. There are no set standards for that. So I would encourage folks to, maybe try to think ahead about as much as possible in terms of the polling place that they'll be using, and possibly trying to reach out if possible prior to election day to local election officials, to ask that there be some temporary measures put into place if a person is going to need that, in terms of the ability to sit and rest during the process, to make sure that they at least have something that's available.
And that must happen to you all the time.
So I'm just are there any more? There are a couple of questions in the chat that I can jump to.
Yeah,
Read
I
it,
see
Ray.
that Janice said, did we say every polling location is required to have an AutoMark voting machine? And the answer to that is yes. Every polling location is required to have an AutoMark voting machine. If the locations are consolidated, so they have more than one ward or area put together, then the one location at least needs to have an AutoMark voting machine. It's preferable for each one to have an AutoMark, but each polling location at least has to have at least one AutoMark voting machine. And as for, do we have an estimate of how much time it will take to complete the survey? I've found that when I've gone out into the field, oh, and thank you, Caitlin, for linking the survey here so that people can check it out. In terms of an estimate for how much time it will take to complete the survey, when I've done them in the field, have been able to do them in about 10-15 minutes, but it depends on the size of the polling place and just sort of individual factors like that. And then I see, is this a new initiative or has this been done previously? In previous years, we had done paid work with the ILCs in order to do similar surveys. This is the first year that we will that we will be in any large number doing having volunteers do this sort of survey. I will be doing my best to inform town clerks about this in advance, though, just so that everything is cleared ahead of time and there are no misunderstandings.
Yeah, and when I've done surveys, generally my practice has been to check in with the person in charge at the polling place and just introduce myself, be very friendly, make sure they understand that we're not out to get anyone. I think most of the poll officials that I've encountered have been very thankful that we're doing this. They want to make sure that voting is as accessible as possible, and they want their polling place to be fully accessible. So generally, they appreciate our presence and our input. So it's a good idea to just kind of check in with them and say, hey, this is why I'm doing what I'm doing. You may not look like a typical voter in terms of going in and giving them your name and going to vote and leaving. So I do that in order to not sort of raise anyone's concerns.
And yes, as Rick said, the survey is fairly easy. The survey can be done pretty much on your mobile phone. It has reminders of a lot of things to look for on it, and you can upload any photos you need to upload directly to the survey, and then the information does get sent directly to us.
Okay, before we progress through the chat, I know there's a question down there. I just wanted to let you know that Kay raised their hand. They also put something in the chat about polling areas of things that are forbidden. So, Kay?
Oh, yes. Go right ahead.
Oh, thank you. I did say in the chat that I have just finished my poll worker training last week, and I learned that cell phone use is not allowed. So it's something to remember that, turn your phone off, don't take calls, don't do texting while you're doing the survey, because that would be a red flag for the poll workers. And no smoking, of course, I think people probably know that. And then the last thing is, if you have any political symbols on you, those aren't supposed to go in to the polling place if it relates to the election at hand. It's the current election that it's not allowed. So those were things I thought I would share. But I did have a question about the AutoMark machines. If we go in and we see there is an AutoMark machine, what is your advice about figuring out whether it's working and whether, whether a person who, I sometimes have brought a blind deaf friend in and I've been her sighted guide, so I could bring her there to the machine, but then we had, struggles with the operations. So how far should we go on that?
Well, I think, first and foremost, you want to check to make sure that it's plugged in. and I laugh as I say that, but you'd be surprised at how many times it's not. And also that it's set up in an area that allows for privacy. When I vote at my polling place, I always use it just to to make sure that it is working. Now, obviously, you'll be doing surveys in polling places where you will not actually be casting a ballot. So you don't have that opportunity. I would encourage you to talk to the poll workers. They'll probably direct you to the warden with a question like that, but talk to them and see if they're knowledgeable about it, and ask them, is it set up, or have you tested it? They're supposed to test it to make sure that it works. And if they run through a test and it doesn't work, they're supposed to immediately get in touch with the Secretary of State's office. And they can usually troubleshoot issues on that day. So make sure that they've run through that process. And if they haven't, ask them to.
So Tom, could I ask you a follow-up on that? So you said that in your polling place, you use the AutoMark machine.
Yeah.
Is that anybody can use it?
Yes.
Okay,
Anybody
well
can
then-
use it.
Yeah.
And they're
Yeah.
not supposed to ask you why. So that's
Okay.
another thing that I encounter. I don't present as a person with a disability, and I have asked to use it and been met with a look of astonishment, like, why do you need to use it?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And I try not to call people out, on the spot for things like that. I don't want to embarrass anybody. Sometimes it's just comes down to a lack of training. But I always mention it to the warden on my way out, to make sure that they know. There isn't a lot. I've seen in my polling place, there's not a lot of turnover from year to year of who's working there. So I think, once they get the message and once they're trained, that will continue. But sometimes, they just need that little extra bit of training.
So one last question. There on one of the slides, it had to do with the ballot marking area. If there was a discrepancy between the slide and what you said about the maneuvering space, because on the slide it did say 60 inches of maneuvering
Right.
space, and you mentioned 48. So which one's correct? 48 inches or 60?
They're in terms of clear turnaround space, like a
Turnaround.
circle. It should
Yeah.
be 60 inches in diameter.
Okay. Thank you for all of that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for sharing the information with us, that you had.
Emily, it sounds like you're responding to a chat question.
I am. So 1 second. I want to make sure I'm reading the question correct. Janice asked, how do we know where to go to conduct the surveys so we don't overlap? And the answer to that is we are going to be putting out a sort of registration link for folks so that they can sign up to do polling places in their area, and so that we have a list of folks doing which polling place so that we know where is being covered. And I know someone had also asked if we were going to share this with the town and city clerks. I have been doing some work with different town and city clerks, so I will be sharing this with them as a resource, yes.
Great. I think we are good. I just want to appreciate everyone's time for staying over with us another few minutes. Oh, Janice has a admin question.
Yes, I will be trying to share it with disability commissions as well.
Well, thank you all for your assistance with this. This is a very important project. We couldn't do it without you.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Take care. I think Emily